In the heart of Umuagu village, Nkiru's life was one of joy, honor, and tradition. Her father, Ezediki, was a respected leader, a man whose word carried the weight of the elders, but beneath the harmony of the village, jealousy and ambition festered in the heart of their closest ally, Chief Okeke. It began with a whisper, a seed of doubt planted by Okeke, claiming that Ezediki had stolen sacred village funds meant for a communal project. The accusations grew like wildfire, feeding the villagers' suspicions. With Okeke's influence, the village council found Ezediki guilty. In an unforgiving judgment, Ezediki was executed at the hands of his own people. His blood stained the ground, and his once prosperous family was reduced to outcasts, stripped of their land and dignity. Nkiru, Ezediki's youngest daughter, bore the weight of grief and a burning need for justice. Night after night, she wandered through the dense forests, her heart heavy with anger. She cried to the ancestors, seeking answers, but none came. Then, one fateful evening, deep within the thick underbrush, Nkiru stumbled upon a forgotten shrine. There, lying in the shadows, was an ancient mask, its design foreign and eerie, pulsing with a sinister energy. The stories passed down through generations warned of the mask. It was said to possess the souls of the vengeful, granting unimaginable power to its wearer, but at a terrible cost. Consumed by her desire for revenge, Nkiru ignored the warnings etched in her memory. She placed the mask over her face, and at that moment, the earth trembled, and the winds howled. A surge of power coursed through her veins, and her once gentle eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. The mask had fused with her soul, granting her the ability to manipulate shadows, summon lost spirits, and inflict unimaginable pain on those she deemed guilty. Nkiru was no longer the broken girl mourning her father's death. She had become an avenger of lost souls. Her first target was Chief Okeke. Under the cover of night, she entered his compound. Shadows moved with her as if obeying her every command. With a single touch, Nkiru summoned the spirits of the wrongfully condemned, their cries of anguish echoing through the air. Okeke awoke to find himself surrounded by the phantoms of those whose lives he had destroyed. His every crime laid bare before him. His screams pierced the night, but no one came to his aid. By dawn, the mighty Chief Okeke had been reduced to nothing, a hollow shell of the man he once was. But as Nkiru exacted her revenge, she felt the mask's grip tightening. The power she once controlled now controlled her, feeding on her hatred, twisting her spirit. Her appearance became monstrous. Her once graceful form now contorted and grotesque, as though the mask had turned her into a reflection of her darkest emotions. Though she had avenged her father, Nkiru's thirst for vengeance remained unquenched. She turned her wrath toward anyone who had ever wronged her family, targeting not only those directly responsible but also their children, their friends, even the innocent who stood by in silence. Each act of violence only fed the mask's hunger, deepening its hold on her. As Nkiru's rampage continued, the village was thrown into disarray. Crops withered, livestock died, and fear spread like a disease. The once vibrant village of Umuagu had become a shadow of its former self, haunted by the specter of Nkiru's vengeance. And still, the mask whispered, urging her to destroy more. The whispers from the mask grew louder with each passing day, their venomous words coiling around Nkiru's mind like snakes. They promised her retribution, justice for every slight her family had suffered. But with every whisper, her memories began to blur. What had once been a clear vision of justice became distorted, twisted by the mask's influence. Nkiru, now barely recognizable to the villagers, moved through the shadows as a specter of death. Her once beautiful face was hidden behind the grotesque mask, her body a hulking figure cloaked in darkness. The mask had fused to her flesh, growing stronger with every act of violence she committed. One night, the elders of Umuagu gathered in secret. Fear had gripped this creature. Once a girl they had known, had become a curse upon the land. Yet, none dared speak of her directly, for they knew the spirits that followed her would hear. The village was dying under the weight of her wrath, and if nothing was done, Umuagu would soon be nothing more than an empty shell, a memory swallowed by darkness. Chief Okeke's death had left a void in the village, but there was no room for new leadership. No one dared step into the role. Now Nkiru's presence loomed over every decision, every breath. So the elders turned to the ancient ways, seeking the counsel of Agwo, the spirit of divination, in a desperate attempt to save their people. It was during one of these rituals that Nkiru's older brother, Obiora, who had been away during their father's downfall, returned to the village. Unlike Nkiru, Obiora had left Umuagu in pursuit of knowledge, traveling to far lands in search of wisdom. When he arrived at the village, he found it in ruins, fields barren, homes abandoned, the air thick with the smell of decay. It was as though the very life had been drained from the earth. Obiora soon learned of the tragedy that had befallen their family and the unspeakable transformation of his sister. He heard whispers of the masked avenger who had once been Nkiru but now lived as something far darker. His heart sank, but he knew he could not turn away. He sought out the elders, determined to find a way to save his sister and the village from the curse that had befallen them. The elders, though wary, told him of the mask, its origins, its power, and the toll it had taken on Nkiru. They revealed that the mask was not of their world, that it had been created by an ancient spirit long banished from their lands. It had been hidden away for centuries, but its power was such that it called out to those whose hearts were filled with rage, feeding on their anger and turning them into instruments of destruction. Obiora, devastated by this revelation, knew there was only one way to stop the curse. He had to confront Nkiru and remove the mask. But the elders warned him removing the mask could kill her, for it had become a part of her very soul. Determined to save his sister, Obiora sought out the old shrine where the mask had first found her. The path was treacherous, the air thick with a sinister energy, but Obiora pressed on. As he ventured deeper into the forest, he felt the presence of spirits, their eyes watching from the trees, their whispers filling the air. The closer he came, the more he realized how far Nkiru had fallen. Finally, he found her, standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the village. Her once delicate form was now a twisted silhouette against the dark sky. The mask had fully consumed her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Shadows swirled around her, and the spirits of the lost, the vengeful, moved like a storm at her command. Nkiru, Obiora called out, his voice trembling. "It is me, your brother. I come to take you home." For a moment, there was no response. The winds howled, and the spirits swirled faster. But then she turned. Her face, once so familiar, was now a monstrous mask. Her eyes empty of recognition. The sight of her broke Obiora's heart, but he stood firm, unwilling to let her slip away entirely. "The village is suffering because of you," Obiora said, his voice steady despite the weight of his grief. "This is not who you are. This is not what father would have wanted." At the mention of their father, something flickered in Nkiru's eyes, a brief moment of clarity beneath the mask. But then, the mask tightened its grip, and the dark whispers surged louder. "They deserve it." Nkiru's voice was unrecognizable, distorted by the mask. "They let him die. They watched as our family was destroyed. The mask is lying to you." "Nkiru," Obiora shouted, "it's feeding on your pain. This is not justice, this is destruction. You are not alone, but if you continue on this path, you will lose yourself forever." Nkiru hesitated, her hands trembling. The mask pulsed with dark energy, resisting Obiora's words, but the bond between brother and sister remained. Obiora slowly approached, extending a hand toward her, his voice softening. "Let me help you. Let me save you." Nkiru's heart battled with the dark force of the mask, torn between her brother's love and the all-consuming thirst for vengeance. The spirits swirled violently around them, sensing her inner conflict. Just as her hand began to lower, reaching toward Obiora, the mask's power surged again, its hunger unrelenting. The mask's power flared, and Nkiru staggered back, clutching her head as if trying to shake off the voices that echoed inside her. Dark tendrils of energy snaked around her, pulling her deeper into the mask's control. Her body convulsed, and her voice, now a guttural snarl, broke through the air. "Leave me, Obiora," she roared, her voice layered with an eerie echo. "You don't understand. They deserve this. All of them betrayed us." Obiora stood firm, refusing to step back even as the darkness surged around him. He could see his sister struggling, fighting against the power that consumed her, but he also saw the mask's influence growing, bending her will to its own. He needed to act before she was lost forever. "I know you're angry," Obiora said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But this isn't the way. Nkiru, you think the mask is getting you strength, but it's only turning you into a weapon. If you continue, you will lose yourself completely. Please, let me help you." For a moment, the tension between them thickened, the air heavy with the pull of the forces love and darkness, hope and despair. Nkiru's hands twitched as if she were trying to rip the mask from her own face, but the shadows that clung to her body grew stronger, pulling her deeper into the abyss. The spirits, restless and howling, swirled faster, urging her to give in to the rage. "I can't stop," Nkiru whispered, her voice breaking as her eyes briefly softened with tears. "It's too late for me. It's not too late," Obiora cried out, taking a bold step toward her. "You are still in there. Nkiru, you've always been the strongest among us. You can't fight this." But even as Obiora reached out to her, the mask fought back with all its might. Dark energy crackled around them, and the spirits became more aggressive, lashing out at Obiora. He felt their cold touch brush against his skin, trying to force him back, but he stood firm, unwilling to leave his sister behind. Just as Nkiru's hand began to lift toward Obiora, the mask erupted in a burst of power. The force knocked him back, sending him crashing into the trees behind him. Nkiru screamed, a sound that echoed through the night. Half human, half beast, her form shifted and twisted, her body contorting as the mask warped her further into its monstrous image. The villagers, hearing the sound, looked up from their homes in fear. Word had spread of Nkiru's confrontation with Obiora, and many had already fled into the surrounding forests, hoping to escape the wrath of the Avenger. But some remained, peering out from behind their doors. Too terrified to move, they saw Nkiru on the cliff, her form towering above the village, a monstrous silhouette against the moonlit sky. Obiora, bruised and bloodied, struggled to his feet. He knew the battle wasn't over yet. The mask may have gained more control, but his sister was still fighting inside. He could feel it. I won't give up on you, Nkiru, Obiora called out, his voice hoarse but determined. No matter what the mask tells you, I know the real you is still in there. Nkiru's monstrous form turned toward him, the mask's glowing eyes locking onto his. For a moment, there was silence. Spirits paused, though instilled, and it seemed as though time itself held its breath. Then, in a sudden rush, Nkiru lunged toward him, her movements unnaturally fast and fierce. Obiora barely had time to react as she crashed down in front of him, her clawed hand reaching for his throat. But just as her fingers grazed his skin, she stopped, her hand shaking violently. The mask hissed in frustration, its power struggling to overpower the bond between the siblings. You need to leave, Nkiru growled, her voice layered with pain and desperation. I don't want to hurt you. I'm not going anywhere, Obiora said, his hand gently reaching out to touch her trembling arm. We'll find a way through this together. Tears welled in Nkiru's eyes as her true self fought against the mask's control. For the first time, she felt the weight of all the destruction she had caused, the lives ruined by her quest for revenge. The faces of the villagers she had punished flashed before her eyes, each one a reminder of how far she had fallen from the person she used to be. But just as she began to waver, the mask tightened its grip. A voice, colder than death, whispered in her ear, feeding her doubts, stoking her hatred. He's lying, the maskist. They all lie. Even your brother will betray you. Destroy him, and your pain will end. Free yourself from this world of betrayal. No, Nkiru screamed, her voice a mixture of defiance and torment. The ground beneath them trembled, and the sky darkened as if the very elements responded to her internal battle. The spirits, sensing her struggle, began to swirl in confusion, their once clear cries now dissonant and chaotic. The forces pulling at Nkiru grew more frantic, as if the mask knew its control was slipping. Obiora saw his chance. Nkiru, listen to me, he said, his voice calm but urgent. The mask only feeds on your pain. It's twisting everything you know, everything you love. Let it go, please, let it go. But the mask, sensing its impending defeat, unleashed its full fury. Dark tendrils erupted from Nkiru's body, lashing out in every direction, tearing at the earth, the trees, and the sky itself. The air crackled with violent energy as the mask fought to maintain its hold, determined to pull Nkiru completely into its darkness. The storm of dark energy swirled violently around Nkiru, the mask's power reaching a fevered pitch. Obiora, though battered and bruised, stood his ground as the dark tendrils lashed out, ripping trees from their roots and splitting the earth around them. He could barely see through the chaos, but his eyes never left his sister. He knew this was the final moment, the point where Nkiru's soul would either be saved or lost forever. Nkiru, he shouted over the roaring winds, his voice filled with desperation. You are stronger than this. You are stronger than it. Don't let it win. But Nkiru's body, twisted and monstrous, writhed as though in agony. Her hands clawed at the mask, pulling at it, trying to free herself. But it was too deeply fused to her face. The spirits, now in a frenzy, darted through the air, their wails mixing with the howling wind, their cries for vengeance louder than ever. The village below trembled, and the few remaining villagers huddled in fear, praying to the gods for mercy. Obiora took another step toward Nkiru, his hands outstretched, his voice soft but insistent. You don't have to fight alone. I'm here. I've always been here. Remember who you are, we are. Nkiru paused, her glowing eyes flickering beneath the mask. For the first time since her transformation, she seemed to hesitate, the dark energy around her faltering. The spirit's wails grew more dissonant, uncertain, as if they could feel her inner conflict. Nkiru's clawed hand trembled as it reached for her brother, but the mask's power surged again, fighting back with brutal intensity. "He's lying," the mask whispered in her mind, its voice a serpent's hiss. "They all lie. He will betray you, just like they all did. No one can be trusted. Not your brother, not the village. Only I can give you the justice you seek." Nkiru's head snapped back, her body convulsing as the mask tightened its grip. Her face twisted in pain, and the ground beneath her cracked as if the very earth mirrored her inner torment. The dark tendrils that spiraled out from her body flailed wildly, ripping through the landscape, leaving destruction in their wake. "I won't betray you, Nkiru," Obiora said, taking another step forward, his voice unwavering despite the storm of darkness swirling around him. "You are my sister. I love you, and I know that somewhere inside, you still love me too." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Nkiru's hand, shaking and twisted, hovered inches away from Obiora. Her monstrous form loomed over him, the mask's glowing eyes burning with a malevolent light. But beneath that darkness, Obiora could see something else as something human, something familiar. "Nkiru," he whispered, reaching out to touch her hand. "Please." Nkiru's eyes flickered again, the glow of the mask dimming slightly. She looked down at her brother, her face contorted with pain and confusion. The whispers of the mask fought to drown out Obiora's voice, but his word-sheath's love cut through the darkness like a blade. She clenched her fists, her whole body trembling as the war between her heart and the mask reached its peak. The spirits, sensing her hesitation, screeched in fury, swirling faster, their voices louder, angrier, but something had shifted. Nkiru's hand, still monstrous and clawed, began to lower, as if she were fighting the mask's influence, fighting for control. Obiora felt hope flicker in his chest. "That's it," he whispered. "You're still in there. Come back to me. Come back to us." But the mask, in a final, desperate bid for control, unleashed a violent burst of energy. Dark tendrils exploded outward, slamming into Obiora and throwing him back with such force that the ground cracked beneath him. He landed hard, the breath knocked from his lungs, and the air around him vibrated with the raw power of the mask's wrath. Nkiru screamed made a sound of pure agony, torn between her love for her brother and the hatred that had consumed her for so long. Her hands clawed at her face, trying to tear the mask away, but it was too late. The mask, sensing its imminent defeat, pulled her deeper into the darkness, twisting her form further, warping her body until she no longer resembled anything human. "No," Obiora gasped, struggling to his feet, his heart racing with fear. The sky above them darkened further, the storm clouds swirling as though responding to the mask's fury. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating Nkiru's monstrous form as she writhed in agony, her body contorted beyond recognition. The spirits howled, their voices a cacophony of rage and despair. In that moment, Obiora knew he had to act. He couldn't wait any longer. Gathering what little strength he had left, he charged toward his sister, his heart pounding in his chest. The dark tendrils lashed out at him, but he pushed through, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear. All that mattered was reaching Nkiru. With one final leap, he grabbed hold of her, pulling her close despite the monstrous shape she had become. His arms wrapped around her, holding her tight, and he whispered into her ear, his voice trembling with emotion. "Come back to me. Nkiru, I'm here. I won't let you go." Nkiru frowned, her body shaking violently. The mask screamed in fury, its power flaring as it tried to tear her away from him. But Obiora held on, refusing to let her go. He could feel the darkness pulling at her, trying to drag her deeper into the abyss. But he refused to let it win. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something shifted. For the briefest of moments, the mask's power faltered. Nkiru's body, still monstrous and twisted, began to relax in his arms, and the dark tendrils that had lashed out at the earth began to recede. The spirits, sensing the change, screeched in defiance, but their voices grew weaker, more distant. The storm above them slowed, the winds coming as if the very air held its breath. Obiora felt her hands on his shoulders still clawed, still monstrous, but gentle. "Nkiru," he whispered. For the first time since her transformation, Nkiru looked at him, truly looked at him, and he saw the faintest glimmer of recognition in her eyes. But the mask, desperate and wounded, was not finished yet. It pulsed with one final surge of dark energy, a last-ditch effort to maintain control. The mask's final surge of energy erupted with a deafening roar, and for a terrifying moment, Obiora feared he had lost his sister forever. The dark tendrils lashed out violently, wrapping around both Nkiru and him, pulling them toward the earth with immense force. The spirits wailed in anguish, their voices blending with the furious storm, and the air crackled with a thick, oppressive energy. But as the mask's power surged, something remarkable happened. Nkiru, in the deepest part of herself, found a clarity she had long forgotten. Amidst the storm of rage, sorrow, and betrayal that had consumed her heart, she remembered who she truly was. She remembered her father's laughter, her mother's kindness, and Obiora's unwavering love. She remembered the village before the hatred had poisoned it, before Chief Okeke's betrayal had torn her world apart.
And for the first time since donning the mask, Nkiru felt something other than vengeance. She felt a sorrow that ran deeper than anger, a sorrow that came from the loss of herself. With a trembling hand, she reached up, her fingers brushing the edge of the ancient mask. It felt cold, foreign, as though it didn't belong to her. It had never belonged to her. She had allowed it to consume her, to feed on her pain and twist her into something she wasn't. Obiora, still holding her tightly, felt the shift. He could sense his sister's presence breaking through, like sunlight piercing the clouds after a long storm. His heart swelled with hope. "You're stronger than this," Obiora whispered, his voice full of emotion. "You always have been. Let it go. Nkiru, let the pain go." Nkiru's clawed fingers hesitated on the mask's surface. The dark tendrils continued to thrash, the mask's power resisting with all its might. But Nkiru's resolve grew stronger. She no longer needed the mask. She no longer needed vengeance. She only wanted peace, for herself, for her family, for the village. With a deep, shuddering breath, Nkiru gripped the mask with both hands and pulled. The mask screamed, a piercing, otherworldly sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The dark tendrils flared, trying to hold on, but Nkiru's will was stronger now. With one final, desperate effort, she tore the mask from her face and flung it to the ground. Immediately, the storm ceased. The dark tendrils dissolved into the air. The spirit's howls faded into silence, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the village lifted. The sky above cleared, revealing a bright moonlit night. The earth, scarred and broken from the mask's wrath, began to calm, and the village below fell into a peaceful stillness. Nkiru collapsed into Obiora's arms, her body reverting to its human form. Though she was weak and trembling, the monstrous features had faded, and she was herself again. Though her face bore the marks of the terrible ordeal she had endured, her breathing was shallow, but she was alive. Obiora held her tightly, tears streaming down his face as he cradled her in his arms. "It's over," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You're free." Nkiru looked up at him, her eyes filled with both pain and relief. "I'm sorry, Obiora," she said softly, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "For everything." "You have nothing to be sorry for," Obiora replied, brushing the hair from her face. "You're my sister. We'll face this together." The mask, now lying discarded on the ground, no longer glowed with dark energy. It was a lifeless relic, its power broken. Without its influence, the village seemed to breathe again, as if it had been holding its breath during Nkiru's torment. The few villagers who remained cautiously emerged from their homes, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had seen the darkness that had consumed Nkiru, the destruction it had wrought. But now, as they gazed upon her frail form in Obiora's arms, they saw the truth. The mask had been the real enemy all along. Chief Okeke, the man who had betrayed Nkiru's family, stood among them, his face pale with fear. He knew that the mask's vengeance had come for him, and he had been spared only because Nkiru had reclaimed herself. He fell to his knees, trembling, his guilt weighing heavily upon him. But Nkiru did not look at him with hatred anymore. She was beyond vengeance now. Her eyes, though weary, were filled with something deeper, something like forgiveness. She had been through hell and back, and though the scars would remain, she had survived. She had chosen her humanity over the darkness. As dawn broke over the village, Nkiru, with Obiora's help, stood up slowly. The weight of her journey had taken its toll, but she was ready to begin again. Together, they would rebuild not just their family, but the village that had been torn apart by betrayal and fear. And as they walked away from the cursed mask, leaving it in the dust, they knew that though the path ahead would be long and difficult, they would face it with hope and love. Two forces far stronger than any darkness. The mask, now forgotten in the rising light, lay still, its dark power sealed forever. For Nkiru, the battle was over, but her story, the story of redemption and healing, had only just begun.